You're listening to the Sastra Spotlight podcast, real conversations with the VCs funding the future, hosted by Tanya Sethi. Let's get into it.
Welcome to Sastra Spotlight. Today in the spotlight, we have with us Arun Penmetsa, partner at Storm Ventures. Arun, great to have you on today. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been a long time in the making. We worked together for a few years now, so great to have you on.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit more about Storm Ventures?
So Storm Ventures, it's an early stage B2B focused fund. We've been around for 25 years now. We've invested through 6 funds. We're in fund 7. Broadly, the focus has been enterprise software and early stage sort of B2B software across sectors. So everything from infrastructure, cybersecurity, go-to-market tech, all the way to verticals like healthcare. I would say we are traditionally quite early stage. We've done some seeds, but generally I would say late seed to Series A is kind of the sweet spot. Generally, when we come in, companies have some signs of product market fit. So they have a handful of customers. And our goal really is to help them unlock growth. And by that, I mean really helping the company move from founder-led sales to a go-to-market team. So building out their sort of that sales strategy, partnerships, marketing cadence. And I think that's a really important part in the market because in today's environment, oftentimes it's very easy to spin up a startup, get some initial traction. But if you can kind of build out your go-to-market and make it repeatable, there's a lot of larger ones who can come in. So that sort of gap is what we're trying to fill.
Amazing. So tell us a little bit more about your investment thesis. What do you look for in a founder or a pitch?
So there's a handful of things. There's sort of more standard or obvious stuff like the team having deep domain expertise in the area that they're going after. Ideally, these are people who've worked on the problem over time. The co-founders have worked together for a number of years. And really one of the things we look for is sort of just passion for the space. Like, why do they want to solve this problem and why are they the right team? Beyond that, we look for a handful of things. One is just really the urgency of the pain point that they're addressing. And there's many sort of phrases for this, but the key thing that we look for is this is something that a potential customer needs to solve today and not wait 6 months, 12 months for it. And I think that's one of the key aspects of any startup, because that's also, if we get to the conversation later, we could talk about why we see some failures happen. But I think that urgency of the pain point is really important. So that's sort of the second thing. We obviously look at sort of the growth potential and what kind of companies are adopting it, things like the size of the market. But I would say the first two are where we spend most of our time trying to understand.
So you've obviously been an investor for many, many years. What drew you to the investment world?
So this wasn't the plan initially. I mean, my background is on the engineering side. I went to business school. I happened to meet a lot of investors on campus. I was intrigued by it. And so I actually interned at Storm in the summer between the 2 years at business school. And I really enjoyed it. I think there's 2 aspects of venture I really like. One is just working with early stage founders. Just when, the company is being incorporated or getting started, I think it's a very special time as a lot of things are being figured out with a small team. So I think the rate of change and the rate of impact you see is very, very high. I think the second aspect of it, at least for me personally, is you're just learning so much through this process. If I do my job right, I'm in a room with someone who's smarter than me on that subject all the time. And I think just intellectually, that's so exciting. And especially given the time we're living in where things are moving so fast, I think it's a very, very exciting thing. And the last thing I would say is I really like working at Storm. Storm's been around for some time. It's a very small team. It's a very collaborative culture. And, we tend to focus a lot on mentorship and support.
Incredible. So throughout this journey that you've been an investor, how is your investment thesis kind of evolved from investing in the first company that you did to how you've seen the success and the failures of all of the companies? How has that evolved?
Yeah, so it's evolved in some ways and in some ways it hasn't. I think, the filters get better the more companies you meet. And as you said, you go through companies that have been successful and, unfortunately some that don't. I think a lot of the basics continue to be the same. You really do need to make sure this is the team that you want to work with, really have believe that this team can solve the problem that they're going after. Because in most sectors, when you're trying to address an issue or coming up with the product, you're not going to be the only. There's going to be many big teams going after it. So you have to really build conviction that this is the team to really back. And I think that hasn't changed. I think probably the urgency aspect has evolved over time. I probably didn't appreciate it as much early on in my career, especially when you meet really high caliber founders, you just want to back them. I think getting smarter and more thoughtful about the problem, the path to product market fit, and eventually just trying to get a better sense of what is the right go-to-market for this company, given the kind of customers they're selling to, given the industry and the vertical they're in, and just being really thoughtful about how we work with founders on that. And that's evolved too. The third thing I'll mention is, early on in my career, I was obviously new and starting to invest, and now I'm on a number of boards. So that perspective of how you continue to work with founders, the challenges that you see the company go through as it scales, that's new. And I'm obviously still early and learning, because that's many year or decade kind
Always
of
a process.
So yeah, so those are some ways in which I think it's evolved.
You talk about the importance of the right kind of team and the right kind of founders. How do you evaluate that in founders that you meet?
Yeah.
Obviously, you haven't worked with before, and they're still very early on in their careers and early on in founding their businesses. How do you evaluate that?
Yeah, so I don't think there's one formula. Part of it comes from just spending a lot of time with them and just trying to get a sense of why they are on this journey, right? I mean, as you can imagine, being a founder is very hard. It's sitting in a lot of risk. There's an opportunity cost because you could be doing something else. There's a financial cost because typically these are very high caliber people, and I'm sure they could go find well-paying jobs in other places. I think part of it is just really trying to understand why this person wants to go through this process of building a company. And as you know, most startups fail, so it's a very risky endeavor too. I think the motivation and the founding story is very important, because that, I think, is what carries some people through the ups and downs, because otherwise it's just there are a lot of days when it's very, very tough. So we really try to understand that. We try to get a sense of, what the founding team is like, how will they work together? Well, what are the synergies? What are the skill sets that one founder has? In case there's multiple co-founders, what are the skill sets that one co-founder has that the other one doesn't? What needs to be added to the team, in our view, to make sure that the journey becomes a little bit easier, right? So what's missing? And the last thing is, I think, just ultimately like passion for solving this problem. Like, they believe this company and this product needs to exist, and they will do sort of whatever it takes to make that happen. I think that's important as well. And I think those qualities are what makes sort of an enduring team and an enduring company. And those are just some of the areas. And, there's other things tied to that, which is experience in the industry, especially if you're building a very technical product, it helps to have that kind of background and that kind of experience. But those are some things.
Amazing. So, Arun, there's a lot of companies that you've invested in and helped to become extremely successful. Some have had successful exits and great success stories. But what about the times when things get really hard? There are companies where a lot of investors say we just had to kind of keep the lights on. They go to difficult phases, maybe not any kind of fault of their own, because it could be trends in the market. It could be so many things, so many factors that affect these things. What advice would you give to founders that are going through that time? How can you as an investor sort of help? And what's your outlook on this?
Yeah. So I think there's a handful of things. One, as you are building the company, I think it's important that the founders and investors are on the same page. And, founders, employees, investors, all parties involved in the business, right? Like, because I think people may have different sort of views and expectations about growth and where the business can go. When things start to change, it is important that you're transparent and in constant communication, because the situation you really want to avoid is you had a couple of bad quarters, the founders are potentially seeing some signals in the market, or investors are seeing some signals across the portfolio. And if you need to make changes to the business, you need to do that quite aggressively and quickly. Part of that is making sure you're measuring the right metrics. And this is one thing we spend a lot of time with our companies on, is we find sometimes there's sort of high level financial details and metrics that companies are measuring, but there are ways to look for early warning signs when you may see potential challenges coming down the road. Like, there's a lot of examples, but just to use a simple example, like the rate of pipeline growth is slowing down, or a source of leads that was working before didn't work this quarter. The question is, do we make a change now? How seriously we take that, and so forth. So I find a lot of situations where things start to go wrong, and this is not just saying founders, even investors, right? Like we're human, we are hoping for the best, and sometimes it's scary and maybe even counterproductive to make changes very fast and react to every signal you see in the market. But making sure you have the right metrics, especially ones that you think are leading indicators of what happens to the business, and being very clear with, your investors, your employees, basically everyone around the table, that this is what's happening in the market, and this is why we think we need to make a change, or this blip is okay because this is a hypothesis that it's a one-time thing. So I think that is important. I think that's partly the reason why a lot of early stage companies tend to also talk to the investors more often. It doesn't have to be a formal board meeting. Like in my case, in many cases, I tell founders, like my founders, like just give me a call anytime. Like just text me and call me. We can have standing calls every few days or few weeks. And if there's nothing to talk, we can cancel it. Anything, just call, right? So that way you have a sense of something has changed. It could be the market. It could be, the economy. It could be a competitor behaving a certain way. I think the sooner you react to this, the easier it will be. And then the last thing I would say is, and maybe this is an obvious statement, is I think we all have to be honest. Like we all have biases. We want to believe that the investment we made is the right thing we did. And, if there's still potential and we want to add second check and third check and a fourth check. And the same thing with founders, right? In fact, it's even more personal and critical for the founders. Like this is their one thing.
It's their baby.
There's a baby, and investors obviously have a portfolio. But I think that's why you need that balancing of founders and the investors and employees and balancing sort of the emotions, right? Like, are we looking at the right way? So I think that's part of the process. And I think companies that do this faster and have that relationship well built and the flow of information working well tend to be able to react much quicker. Now, the company may still fail because, as you said, it's just a bad market, the regulation changed, and then, we can work together to figure out what the exit is.
There could be endless things, but like you said, the key would be to have those metrics in place. Yeah. We can kind of oversee, get a good view of what's going on in the business at any time, and then deliver it as kind of needed.
Exactly.
As an investor, when founders are sort of building this business, because you invest in a lot of businesses really early on, where it might just be the founders, just themselves, and they're on that journey to kind of build a team and scale the business. What are some of the things that you advise them to get some of those first hires and get that team in place?
We spend a lot of time just thinking about where are sort of the gaps in the team and what the market needs or what the company needs at this point. It just really varies on what the founding team brings and how much of the team is built out. But a few things that we think about is there's obviously things like we need to build more engineering. And that's where we spend a lot of time on the product roadmap, like which engineers and what pace we hire. We spend a lot of time thinking about, as I said earlier, unlocking growth. One thing that we try to avoid is scaling that go-to-market team too quickly before we feel like our go-to-market is repeatable. And that's a mistake we've seen a lot of companies make, which is why they run out of money. And, even our companies, even we get it wrong sometimes. So on the go-to-market side, a lot of the initial time once we invest is spent just trying to build that framework around what is your customer's journey like. I mentioned what is the urgent pain, and you have a number of other metrics we track, like times to first value and the wow factors in the sales process. And once we feel like that has been sort of set, that's when we go a bit more aggressive. And we tie that to a number of metrics. So I think that's sort of more the straightforward part, which is hiring a go-to-market team in engineering. Other areas that we try to help our companies get hires more quickly than they traditionally would is bringing on someone in finance. It can be a junior person. Bring on someone in RevOps because tracking these metrics is important. So, because what usually happens in very early stage companies is the founders are doing a lot of this work. And while it is important and they need to know the numbers, I don't think that's the best use of their time. And if you can offload those hours to someone who's a professional who can probably do it much faster, then that frees up the founders to focus on more strategic things. So a lot of the early hiring is built around the culture you want to build, the gaps in the team, and where our resources are best spent, rather than, just trying to hire a certain number of people. And again, I think if you measure all these metrics well, you'll know when something is working and how quickly you should accelerate there. Where something is not working and you probably want to wait to hire those areas.
You mentioned founders obviously trying to do it all themselves, which obviously if you're the founding team, you're the only ones. Obviously you'd have to just do everything, to do everything possible.
Yeah.
So a lot of companies sort of start with these founder-led sales. When do you think is a good time for founders to sort of pivot to then build a team and build that go-to-market motion that can exist and function without them being present?
Yeah. Founder-led sales is one of the most critical parts of the journey, because early on, founders are the ones who have a hypothesis, they understand the problem, they have the passion, they bring the credibility in front of customers, and you need to really figure out what is the problem you're solving. Is it urgent enough? Like I said, what do you need to say at every step in the sales process to to get a customer to sign. So you're essentially building that, and we call it the customer-driven sort of journey, our customer hero journey. And Tati, one of my partners, has written a lot about this. That playbook, in our view, needs to be built by the founders because they intuitively will have a sense of the problem, what to say when, like I mentioned, and get those initial customers. The more you have that playbook built out, I think the easier it is to start hiring the team. In fact, one of the things we do with a lot of our companies is once we invest, we spend a lot of time just kind of sitting and walking through that framework and trying to just get a sense of how close we are to understanding that customer journey. Because generally what happens is in almost any company, when you build your sort of sales funnel, it's a very startup centric or the vendor centric sales funnel. You go from your MQL to SL to SQL, whatever, demo, close, and all that. Your end customer doesn't care what they are in that funnel. They care about how they are being perceived within their own company and whether the product is solving their problem. So what we recommend, just as a very simple example, and there's a lot more behind this, is in parallel to building this sort of sales funnel, which you should maintain, you have to build sort of a customer journey that tracks as you move through your sales funnel, what is happening in the customer. And that we found is one of the most powerful ways to really figure out how close you are to building that customer playbook. And when you feel like you've identified all those steps and you can move a customer through that, that's probably the best time to go build a sales team because the founders can sort of give this playbook to them and say, go execute. And obviously this takes iteration, every time you talk to somebody, it needs to be improved. And this is typically for areas where your sales team, product-led growth is different.
Completely different, yes.
But anyway, that's sort of a more nuanced answer to your question about when to hire. You want something to be repeatable because there are definitely sales reps and sales leaders who are that 0 to 1, go do this intuitively because they've done this. But in the vast majority of cases, you want to give something prepared and pre-built to your marketing.
Absolutely. And as a salesperson as well, coming into a role or coming into a company where there is that kind of repeatable business model or they've seen the founders have success with multiple customers, I think that's a great place to be in and then to build on from there as well.
Exactly. We've known great salespeople who will come in early and kind of do this semi-founder job to figure it out. And that's what excites them. But, most reps are, focused on hitting their quota and so that process, right? And that's their role. That's why they were hired. So you'll just make their lives a lot easier if you have something that can help them.
No, amazing. I love that. You touched a little bit about culture. So obviously we talked about metrics, which are some of the tangibles. You can put them, you can sort of make sense of it. But what about the intangibles of building a startup? Culture is an important thing.
I mean, the culture ultimately has to come from the founders, right? And that's why those early hires are so important. Because they are the ones who actually observe and see what the founders do and what they recognize and reward versus what they feel is the wrong approach. And that's what sort of builds the culture, right? So, as the saying goes, like culture is like what happens when you're not in the loop, right? So that's why, the early hires, oftentimes the founders, they take time to figure out who to hire. In many cases, it comes from their network because these are people they work with and know they can collaborate and probably have similar values. And that's why, even investors in the early days, if the founders want us to, we do get involved. We tell founders like those first few hires, it depends on when we come in, but if it's just the founders, like take your time with those initial hires. I know we want to move fast. I'm sure about this a lot, but the worst thing you could do is hire the wrong person and then having to let them go is such a huge disruption.
Sets you back quite a lot.
Yeah. There are ways to sort of test for this. One thing we see a lot is not as much on engineering, but in other roles, people come on as sort of for 3 months, they consult or they do something part-time and you can test your working relationship. That usually works well. I mean, especially today with the tools you have out there, it's not like everybody needs to be in the same office all the time. So you can work remotely. And as long as you interact well together, I think you can test a lot of that out.
Amazing. And let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the industry.
Yeah.
There's a lot of exciting startups. AI has kind of helped a lot of startups to a lot of different business ideas essentially to come about.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of companies coming about using AI in many, many different ways. Is there a particular area that you're excited about, that you're seeing sort of progress?
Pretty much any industry is being impacted by AI, right? I mean, we tend to invest more sort of the tooling and I would say mostly the application layer. So a lot of those sectors are being impacted by AI. I would say the verticals are probably seeing the most traction at this point in terms of getting AI applications and agents into production today. I think partly that's because you can sort of constrain the context and train your models more effectively for those use cases, as opposed to have a general agent that can do a lot of different things. So that's exciting. I think we're kind of shifting from this phase maybe a year or two ago to more using these models for asking and getting data back, to now just running actual agentic workflows where the model and the agents can do multiple tasks in a row. So that shift is happening. I think in the B2B space, it's still early compared to on the consumer side, partly because, as you can imagine, you need things to be accurate, not hallucinate, security, compliance, a lot of these things. So, I mean, as you mentioned, the pace is quite extraordinary. And we've seen this, right, in areas like legal tech and a few others. There's been companies that have moved very, very fast. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely an exciting time. I think, we're continuing to invest in sort of these AI first companies that were born post LLMs or post in the last 3 or 4 years that have really embraced this architecture and are figuring out things like how do we build the right data set, and how do we sort of set up the right agent for specific workflows, and eventually move on to general agents. Then there's a set of companies that are sort of pre-LLM era that do have the advantage of having some scale because they have a lot of customers now. They have this data set and are either, re-architect, maybe a too strong a word, but like figuring out what their agentic strategy is going to be while leveraging their existing relationships. So, it's everything from the large incumbents to sort of the pre-LLM companies to like the post-LLM companies, all are sort of competing, which is, very exciting to see.
Yeah, very, very exciting time. No, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been great. There's a lot of things that we always talk about, but great to know a little bit more about your journey as well. So thank you so much for coming on and giving wonderful advice. The only thing I'd ask before we leave is, what advice would you have for founders who have a product, thinking of building and scaling a business? What sort of things should they have ready before they sort of come and see an investor?
I think maybe two things. One, as I mentioned earlier, just really think through what is the problem you're solving and why that needs to be addressed today and why you're the team to do it, right? So spend time with your prospects, think through the urgency of the problem. I think that's probably one of the things that excites investors the most. And then the second thing is just the team you're building, right? I mean, that's the company you're building. So I think these are the two areas to focus on. It's probably obvious advice, but those are the areas to really think about before you start thinking about raising institutional rounds. And in the first institutional round can be just a pre-seed, so it's early, right? The situation you want to avoid is you're just experimenting or trying to figure things out. Obviously, if you're been a very successful founder or executive in the past, I think investors will back you because they see that track record of success. But you could say, especially your first company, you want to have some of these things in place before raising institutional money. Because, raising money from investors does sort of start a clock, right? Like you want to be sure you are ready for that. People call this treadmill, but like you want to be sure you're ready for that journey as well.
Yes, absolutely. No, great advice. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Of course, thank you, man.
Thank you for tuning in. Follow us along for another Spotlight next week.